Go. All right. Yep. We record just so that we can give people the session later if they missed it or if they want to go over certain parts. Welcome everybody to the NextUp Solutions monthly Agile webinar. Thanks for joining us again. Happy Friday. Today we're going to be talking about the three major challenges of Agile scaling. Before we do that, I'm going to start off with a little bit of introductions just in case we haven't met before. This is me. There is way too much stuff on this slide, but I put it all in one place so that you can forget it quicker. I am Dr. Patrick McConnell. You can call me Mack because my PhD is irrelevant to everything we're going to talk about in this class, so don't sweat it. I've been an Agilist for what goes for a really long time in this space, almost 15 years actually. At this point, I should update the slide. I started off my Agile journey as a product owner, primarily building geospatial technologies for government agencies in the DC area where I used to be based. Did that for a long time, and then I became a Scrum Master, and then I became a full-time Agile coach for a bunch of years, ultimately becoming the director of the first Agile Center of Excellence at one of the gigantic government-focused system integrator companies. And for most of that time, I was also pursuing becoming a certified Scrum Trainer, which is a very difficult thing to do. I finally achieved that in 2018, and since then, I mostly just get to do stuff like teach classes and make grown-ups play silly games. And sometimes I still get to do a bit of coaching, and that's fun. Let's see. As for our organization, we're actually two different entities, Acceleration and NextUp Solutions. Acceleration is our software development practice, where we build amazing software applications for all sorts of organizations, operating on kind of an interesting model. What we do is we hire largely college students as they are finishing up degrees in things like computer science. They then come to work for us part-time in between their classes, doing real software development and testing at real organizations, but under the guidance of our expert mentors who teach them that craft and keep them from blowing anything up. The companies that hire us get fantastic work done at great rates. The students get amazing experience, which often lets them go off to great careers after they graduate. Sometimes it's some of the same companies where they were working already before. So it ends up being kind of a win-win-win for everybody. We're very proud of what we do at Acceleration. And if you have any needs in that space, by all means, reach out. I will connect you to people who will tell you all about it, or you can learn more at acceleration.com. As for NextUp Solutions, we are primarily a certified Agile training provider based in the DC area. We run all sorts of live taught, expert-led, games-based Agile courses, lots of Scrum Alliance certified classes, also Kanban University, IC Agile, a bunch of other things, and of course, lots of customized training as well that fits a particular organization's specific needs, whatever's going on there. And we are a full-service Agile coaching and collaboration partner, which means we do everything from embedded team coaching, helping new Agile teams get up and running or existing ones get better, to helping whole enterprises plan out or improve an Agile transformation at scale. And then the third leg of that practice is helping leaders grow into Agile leaders. And as some of you may already know, the ability of bosses to actually embody an Agile mindset is often a limiting factor in terms of how much value we get out of Agile teams. So helping people grow into Agile leaders is a very important part of what we do on the coaching side. All right, and if you have needs in any of those areas, whether it's Agile training, Agile coaching, any of that, again, please reach out and we would be happy to assist you, whatever your needs might be. All right, so enough of the introductions. Let's go ahead and get into the talk. Today we're going to be talking about scaling, which is the term for how we do work that's bigger than a single small Agile team can do. In general, all Agile methods are structured kind of as counterpoints to the old waterfall way of thinking, where in waterfall, we're going to do a process of things. We're going to go through a series of steps one time, and we can't go on to the next step until the prior step is over. One of the conceits of basically every Agile model is that instead of doing that as a one-time single stage process, we're going to do that over and over and over in a tiny loop. And generally, we're going to do that with very small teams, is the idea. So that we're always inspecting, adapting, we're getting better at product direction based on feedback, we're getting better at being teams and delivering based on our own continual introspection and things like that. And when I say small teams, I mean small teams. So Scrum, for example, which is the most commonly used Agile framework that's out there, going back, oh, more than a decade at this point, really only has 3 roles. We have one person whose job it is to think about what are all the things we might need to do. In Scrum, that's called a product owner. We have a bunch of people who are going to actually build the stuff. We call those people developers. And we have a Scrum Master whose job it is to coach and look out for the well-being of those folks as a servant leader. This is still, though, a pretty small group. 1 product owner, 1 Scrum Master, and typically less than 9 developers, which means we wouldn't expect your typical Scrum team to get bigger than about, 10 people. It's pretty small, and many Scrum teams are smaller than that. So what happens if we're working on something that a small team can't get to a meaningful point of progress in the time that we have? What we don't want to do is take the small, highly functional team and throw more bodies at them, because that's going to make them less functional. Every time we increase the number of people on the team, we increase the number of communication channels in that group, it gets harder and harder for the team to understand, what are we even doing today? Or when was a choice made? Or why did we make a particular choice? All of those everyday fundamental questions about how they self-organize and manage as a team become impossible when the team gets too big. That's why we like small teams. So instead of making the small team less effective by making it bigger, we keep teams small and we just add more of them. That's what scaling is. We become a team of small teams, or a team of teams, or whatever, depending on how we're doing. All right, so that is in general kind of the premise of Agile scaling. Scaling is really a term, an umbrella term that we use to apply to a bunch of different frameworks that are supposed to help us with organizing everything above the team layer. The thing, though, is that scaling makes everything really, really, really complicated. It is not just as simple as, oh, we just need more teams, because all of the core questions, really, about how are we going to organize the work and do the work and still do our inspect and adapt cycles become a lot more complicated. So that's why we have scaling frameworks. And as I said, there's a lot of them. Just to give you a couple of visual examples, this is from Scrum at Scale, which was a method started by Jeff Sutherland. He's one of the founders of Scrum. Here is Nexus. That's founded by Ken Schwaber. He's the other founder of Scrum. Here we have Large Scale Scrum, or LESS, which was founded by Craig Larman and Bas Vodi, based on something like running 500 sprint level experiments with teams at Nokia some years back. And then, of course, the one that people know most often these days seems to be SAFe, Scaled Framework for Enterprise. This is version 5 of the framework, although I think they just came out with 6.0. But anyway, still looks pretty similar. Sometimes they just kind of change the titles. As you can guess from looking at this framework, that's what I mean about complexity. I mean, just looking at the SAFe slide here, if you were to visit scaledagileFramework.com and you look at this graphic, every single icon on this chart is a clickable link that will take you to a, I don't know, 5 to 10 page white paper explaining what that particular element is supposed to be and how it's supposed to fit into the larger thing and who's involved and all that kind of stuff. That's a lot of complication. So I'm certainly not going to be able to explain everything about scaling in all of these frameworks to you, even in a multi-day class, let alone just a 1-hour lunchtime webinar on a Friday. But that's okay. That's not really my goal. Instead of trying to explain all of the little intricacies of every one of these frameworks, or even just one of them, instead what we're going to do is talk about really what I see as the 3 big sources of challenge in scaling. And we'll talk about kind of the available choices that these frameworks tend to make about how to solve that challenge at each step. And we'll talk a little bit about trade-offs at each step along the way. So for me, they break down really into 3 areas: the front-end challenge, the mid-sprint challenge, and the back-end challenge. And we can just go in that order. So let's start with the front-end challenge. The front-end challenge of scaling, when we are a team of teams, really comes down to 2 questions. How many product backlogs are we going to have? And how many product owners are we going to have to be responsible for and maintain those backlogs? And those are generally related questions. Usually you have a product owner for every level of backlog that you decide to use. It's not always exactly the case, but anyway. So in terms of the backlog question, for example, we really kind of have two choices. Looking at the four frameworks that I'm mentioning here, we can have a unitary backlog. That means no matter how many teams are working from it, there is still just one product backlog, period. All of the product backlog items related to that particular product and its current product goal live in that one list. And all of the teams involved are pulling and planning sprints from that list all at the same time. So they all basically are being fed by the same list of stuff. You see that approach in Nexus, and you see that in large-scale Scrum or less. The other option on the backlog question would be some kind of stratified backlog, meaning what we have is kind of this nested hierarchical structure. We have some kind of overarching backlog, and the items in that are kind of bigger deal goals. Those get then broken down into smaller, whatever team level size means, and those items are farmed out across one or more team level product backlogs. Teams are planning only from their own lowest level backlog, whatever that is the idea. But the ideas in each team's independent backlog are supposed to be derived from the higher level portfolio thing, whatever it is. Different scaling frameworks, if they use a stratified approach, will use different terminology for the portfolio thing. It could be 2 layers, like what you see on the chart in front of you right now. In SAFe, it could be 3 or even 4 layers, where you have a highest level thing at a portfolio that gets decomposed into capabilities at the solution layer, and then capabilities get decomposed into features at the program level, and then features get decomposed into stories at the team level. So how many tiers do we have in a stratified method might vary from one framework to the next. In SAFe, it's kind of a choose your own, 2, 3, 4. Scrum at scale, it's usually 2. Sometimes it could be 3, but it's generally 2 is my impression. Less huge, which you don't hear about very often, is kind of a way of splitting really, really large product efforts up into smaller kind of scaling chunks. And they would have an overarching product backlog, and they might split it up into area product backlogs. Still, generally a 2-tier in less huge, regular less, unitary. So those are the 2 choices around product backlogs. However many product backlogs we have to have some number of product owners to maintain and refine and own those backlogs. And here again, we kind of have several choices. In Nexus and less, I just said we have a unitary product backlog. That means we have a unitary product owner. No matter how many teams are in that structure, there is one product owner. Teams don't have their own product owner equivalent. There is one product owner shared across all of those groups. In other structures, you might have kind of a 2-layer nesting thing where you have some kind of overarching product owner who's supposed to think about forest level considerations across the entire product effort or across the entire program. And then you might have team product owner equivalents who are kind of taking the backlog objectives assigned by a product owner and refining those with their individual teams. They're planning and sitting with those teams. They're kind of a part of those groups. You see that in Scrum at scale and a 2-layer structure of SAFe, for example. But then we can make things a lot more complicated. In SAFe, for example, we might have 3, or as I mentioned, even 4 tiers of product backlog. That means we might have 4 tiers of product owner, really, where you have team product owners for each individual team that nest inside of some kind of product manager who's looking across an entire, well, release train is the phrase that SAFe uses for a bundle of Scrum teams. And then you might have product managers nesting inside of a solution owner who nests really inside of the program portfolio management team or something along those lines. So again, basically, however many levels of backlog we kind of have to have that at least number of levels of product owner. So those are really the choices at the front end. None of these choices are necessarily always correct. Whatever we pick, whether it's the, how many backlogs, how many product owners, there are considerations, there are pluses and minuses associated with each one of these. And just to give you a few things to think about here for the front end, let's start with the backlog question. If we have a unitary backlog across the entire program, well, then bottom-up clarity of vision is a lot easier because all teams are pulling from the same product backlog. That means it's really easy for each team to understand, how does this particular backlog item that we're going to do this sprint fit into the larger product goal? That's also generally nimbler for individual teams too. So imagine a team plans to do a particular thing in a sprint. And then in the middle of that sprint, they find out, oh, wait, that thing is not actually possible. We can't finish that. Huh. Well, what should we do instead with the remaining time we have in the sprint? In a unitary backlog structure, it is way easier for that team to go talk to their product owner and figure out what is the best thing for the overall product for our team to do next. Those questions are a lot harder when we are stratified, because often the stratified backlog items all the way down at the team level don't necessarily have an obvious direct connection to end product value. They're a piece of an idea. So when a thing gets blocked, it could be a lot harder for the team to understand what is the impact of that blockage, what would be the best thing for us to replace that work with. So anyway, strengths of unitary backlog: bottom-up clarity from teams, nimbler for teams to make adjustments when surprises happen. On the stratified backlog side, it's a lot easier to establish top-down clarity of vision from the highest levels of management and vision down. Isn't necessarily the other way. It might be hard for teams to understand why are we doing the things that we're doing, but at least from the highest level of the structure, however many tiers we're using, it's pretty clear to those folks how is the work being orchestrated across the structure. Also, organizations sometimes prefer the stratified approach because it feels a lot more like some of the traditional program management patterns that they may have been using before they adopted, Scrum or whatever other Agile approaches we're using. That doesn't necessarily mean that's a net benefit. I don't necessarily know that it feels like what we used to do before intrinsically is better necessarily, but it is often more attractive to organizations for that reason. On the product owner question, a single product owner for the entire product generally means we have much better clarity of authority about who's allowed to make choices about product ownership because there's only one product owner. Also, clarity of accountability is a little easier too, because we all know who's supposed to be making these choices and who we're supposed to call or email to get a decision when we need one. On the hierarchical product owner side, certainly it's easier to divide up the labor. Having only one product owner who is supposed to be doing backlog refinement with, say, 9 Scrum teams, that is a huge amount of work, even if they're kind of doing it all together. Would you put all of those teams in a single room? That doesn't sound very efficient. But on the other hand, if the product owner is only talking to, say, delegates of each team, that means there are folks on each team whose voice isn't necessarily being represented in those conversations. We could be missing stuff. Or maybe the product owner is trying to do, in a unitary sense, product ownership with each team individually, and then they just never have time for anything else. That sounds like a lot of work. So if we have a stratified hierarchical definition of product owner, that division of labor question might get a little easier. It also might mean that teams can expect a lot more access to their particular PO. Their individual lowest level product owner is assigned to just their team. They should always be able to figure out what that person is because they're not shared across the entire structure. So those are the front end trade-offs. Moving on then, let's talk about the mid-sprint challenge. However we square the circle of the front end questions, okay, let's say we've made some choice. We've picked a framework. We've decided how we're going to structure backlogs and product ownership, and now we're planning sprints. Cool. How do we deal with cross-team coordination when problems arise in the middle of sprints? What happens when dependencies pop up? All those kind of things. That's the mid-sprint challenge. And every scaling framework has some mechanics to deal with this. One thing we can do at the outset is try to minimize knowable cross-dependencies in the teams. And basically every scaling framework would tell you that you're supposed to be focused on that. Some pay more attention to that than others, but it's in all of them pretty much. And by cross-functionality, what I mean is this. With a single independent Scrum team, the notion is within the developers, I have all of the skills and abilities needed to go from an idea to whatever done means in a single sprint. It doesn't mean everyone on the team can do everything. It just means as a group, they can do all the things. That is a very strong pattern. When we can commit to that, we get really amazing results. We get a lot of actual business agility. Unfortunately, sometimes when an organization scales up from one team to a team of teams, someone makes an unfortunate choice and they say, you know what, in the name of efficiency, why don't we structure these teams based on specialized skill sets? So we'll have a front-end team and a middleware team and a back-end team. Oops. The problem with that is we used to have a single cross-functional team that could get done on its own. Now I have siloed skill sets, which means, oops, institutionally, we just backed into waterfall again. Anything one team does is going to have to be worked on by multiple other teams to get to prod. And in this structure that you see on the slide right now, the shortest number of sprints that this structure could get an idea into production would be 3. So if they're doing 2-week sprints, that means this is at least 6 weeks to get to something that we can touch. In reality, it's probably longer than that, because anytime a problem is discovered after a team thinks they're done with a thing, it's going to have to go back through that team again, and probably every other team in the structure too. That tends to be really slow, all those handoffs. So one thing we can do to cut down on the cross-team dependencies is to really commit to cross-functionality. And not just independent team cross-functionality, but even kind of universality of skill sets. If I have 3 teams that can all get to prod on their own, and they all have more or less overlapping development skills, that means not only can any team deliver value on their own, but also I could reposition work more or less in real time. That's nimbleness. That's great. So one thing we can do to try to cut down on the cross-team dependencies is this committing to real cross-functionality in our teams. That helps with federation. That helps with loosening the coupling. That's what we want to do. Another thing we might do is, even after all of that, even after making sure that we're cross-functional and we've restated backlog items to try to minimize dependencies that we know about, things like that, dependencies still might come up. So another method that some scaling frameworks like SAFe especially use to deal with this is by adding a second dimension to backlogs, and that dimension is time. So here I have 3 teams with a bunch of backlog items. Where you see things stacked, that means whatever's on top is dependent upon the thing behind it being done. So in team A here at the top of their backlog, the most important thing to do is that purple card, that purple story, but they can't build that till the green one behind it's done, and they can't build that green one until the red one behind it's done. So how do they sort all this stuff out? Well, they farm things out in time based on dependency. And each team would work all of the most important unblocked items they could each sprint. So that's called story mapping. Not to be confused with customer journey mapping, but it's basically a way of just sorting out dependencies in a backlog. And you can use exactly this approach when there are cross-team dependencies. So we just need more arrows. Where we see backwards dependencies, where a team, for example, can't start a thing until they need something from some other team, we keep farming things out in time. And if each of these 3 teams does about 3 items a sprint, that means their sprints would line up like this as of right now. So we can do story mapping within a single team's backlog. We can do it across a bunch of teams. In SAFe, when a bunch of teams plan a program increment, which is usually about 3 months at a time, they do this exercise where they build something called the program board, which, when we used to do these things in person, is literally people putting cards on a wall and connecting cards with yarn across a various teams' swim lane. And then we keep replanning until all of the yarn points to the right. That said, one thing to be careful of, just because we visualize these dependencies doesn't mean we're good now. Each of those dependencies is risk. Think about Team C down here. The most important thing in their backlog to get done is this green card all the way at the end. What this board is telling me right now is the best case scenario is they can start it in 5 sprints. if any of these other items gets delayed, that's going to keep pushing that item out in time. So it's always better to cut the tape or the yarn. It's always better to find a way to break a dependency so that we can have more independence across teams, because that removes schedule risk. All right, so cross-functionality in teams, cross-team story mapping. Maybe we can get ahead of these things. That'd be great. Having said that, things are still going to pop up. Dependencies we didn't realize before we started the sprint are going to occur, and we're going to end up in situations where Team A is like, hey, we need Team B to fix a thing for us. And Team B is like, well, we can't because we're already busy helping Team C. And Team C is like, yeah, they're helping us with the thing that Team A asked us for last sprint. And we're just stuck in a circle because we're in a traffic jam. We can't get out of our own way. So scaling frameworks look for some kind of mechanic that helps teams with this mid-sprint collaboration challenge. And for most scaling frameworks, the answer is something called Scrum of Scrums. Scrum of Scrums has been around a long time. It actually predates basically all of the formal scaling frameworks. And for a long time, if you ask the founders of Scrum, how do I do work that's bigger than a single Scrum team? Their answer would be, well, you just do Scrum of Scrums and it's fine. I think that advice is a little over optimistic, but anyway, the notion behind Scrum of Scrums is that I had each team doing its own individual sprint cycle. So they do their own sprint planning, their own daily scrums, their sprint reviews, their retros. But then some number of times per week, each team also sends a representative to this other meeting called the Scrum of Scrums, where people would inform other teams kind of like they would in a daily scrum. You know, a typical question format would be, since we last met, my team is now working on. My team has finished the following thing since we last met. We do have this one obstacle that we're working on. So it's kind of like individual team members in a single team's daily scrum, except they're talking at the level of their entire team and they're informing the other teams. They also, though, would answer a fourth question, which goes, what blockers are we about to create for other teams? So for example, imagine a team saying, all right, welcome to the Scrum of Scrums. Hey, since we last met, we finished this feature that we were working on. That's great. Now we're working on this other one. But we do have this obstacle that's keeping us from getting it done. To fix it, we're going to have to pull such and such offline, such and such environment offline for a day to patch something, and that'll fix the obstacle for us. Is that a problem for anybody, pulling that environment offline for a day? That is the point of the Scrum of Scrums. That's so that other teams can hear that and put up their hand and go, ooh, we have a super important demo tomorrow for a customer. Can you wait another day before you pull that environment offline? That'd be really helpful. So those kind of cross-team coordinations, dealing with surprises in the middle of sprints, things like that, that's kind of the premise of Scrum of Scrums. One quick side note, because the real purpose of Scrum of Scrums is those kind of what blockers are in our way and what blockers are we creating for other teams kind of conversations, the representatives that go should be technical. And that is a mistake I see a lot of teams making, where teams want to send their Scrum Master, okay, or they want to send their product owner, maybe also okay, but they should also be sending at least one person who is technical from the team, one developer from each team. Otherwise, if someone says, we're going to pull this environment offline for a day, does anybody care? And no one else in the room knows the answer to that question, what's the point of this meeting? So anyway, so that's Scrum of Scrums as a mechanic. In terms of comparing the various scaling frameworks out there on this question, there aren't necessarily different ways of doing the Scrum of Scrums. It's, do we do it at all, is the question. And the less folks don't. The large-scale Scrum folks feel that Scrum of Scrums is a trap, because in their experience, as they were developing less, what they see is Scrum of Scrum starts out with good intentions, but then they saw it quickly devolve often into meaningless kind of statusing, where we aren't actually solving problems. We're talking about things totally unrelated. It's just kind of an admin, and lots of people are just talking, but no one's actually listening. There's no conversation. It's just people just saying stuff into the air. So instead of Scrum of Scrums and less, they primarily use a method called just go talk, which is exactly what it sounds like. The idea is just if you have an issue that you need to talk about with another team, just go talk to them. That's it. If we're in the middle of something very technical that needs a lot of day-by-day collaboration, maybe we also send a listener to each other's daily Scrum meetings on their individual teams, but we don't do Scrum of Scrums. In SAFe, the recommendation is that we do a weekly one or a bi-weekly one. And then in Nexus or Scrum at Scale, we would do it every day. So in Nexus or Scrum at Scale, every day, we would have our own team daily Scrum, and we would send a representative to the overall kind of scaled Scrum or meta Scrum or Nexus integration Scrum, whatever phrase we want to use. It's basically all the same thing. So that is the mid-sprint challenge. Again, none of these answers are perfect. There are trade-offs here with each one. As for the just go talk approach, the strengths there are definitely less team meetings, less individual team time being taken up with the overhead of having to go to a Scrum of Scrums. We don't get the problem of it devolving into status because we're just not doing it. So we don't even have that possibility in the first place. Also, a strength of just go talk is if it's going to work, that requires us to have a lot better awareness across all of the teams about what other teams are doing, because otherwise, how would we know who to talk to? Finally, it's premised on the notion that teams are pretty loosely coupled, which means we are more likely to just realize agility in general. On the Scrum of Scrum side, instead of having this ad hoc mechanism like just go talk, we have this routinized venue for collaboration where we are supposed to show up and talk to each other a couple of times a week or every day, whatever it is, which means we have this space already created for when unknown unknowns pop up, for when there are surprises. Imagine, for example, a team has an issue and they have no idea what other team to talk about that issue with to get it fixed. That makes just go talk kind of hard. They'd have to talk to maybe every team in the structure, as opposed to if we have a Scrum of Scrums, maybe they could just say it out in that room that day, and the teams that need to be involved could raise their hand and say, oh, we can help with that, talk to us. Maybe that's easier. Scrum of Scrums is also far more necessary when we don't have loosely coupled teams, where we aren't necessarily exactly cross-functional, where we have fixed cross-team dependencies that for whatever reason we feel we can't remove. So for example, teams can't do everything for themselves because there's a part of their work that, based on some contract, has to be owned by some other team. Well, if we can't fix that bottleneck, maybe we kind of have to use Scrum of Scrum so that we have a venue to talk to them all the time. I will say be a little careful with that, because again, this feels a little bit like we're kind of putting a Band-Aid on a root problem that's in the way of agility. Don't let the existence of the Band-Aid kind of tell you that it's okay to exist that way forever. We still want to be getting to a point where we don't need all that close collaboration. All right, so that's end-to-end overall, kind of the second big source of challenge, the mid-sprint challenge. Which brings us to the third and final one, which is the back-end challenge, and this has to do with learning. How do we know we're doing the right stuff as a program? How do we know that we are getting better as a program, that we are getting better at delivering value, that we're getting more and more loosely coupled, all those kind of core team level questions of agility that get harder when we are programmed? We need some kind of mechanisms to rationalize the feedback we're getting and install some kind of cadence. Typically with a single Scrum team, for example, I'm really trying to answer two feedback questions all the time. The first one is, does the thing work? Which I find out by building and releasing some slice of a product. And then the more important question is, have we actually solved anyone's problem? Have we met the need? Which I find out by watching the intended users interact with the thing in production. I can't answer the have we met the need question until I answer the does it work question, but still I have to answer both of them as often as possible. The longer it takes me to answer those two questions, that's really my incremental risk at any one time. That's the amount of work we might have to throw away once we get to the end of that feedback loop and realize, whoops, we built the thing that no one wants. We still haven't met their need. So the more often I'm answering both of those questions, typically that lowers my incremental risk, because that means I can only go in the wrong direction for so long before I get feedback and I can course correct. So fairly straightforward with a single team. Every Agile framework has methods of feedback on these questions built in, but it gets a lot more complicated when we are really building several interrelated, similar but different products for different constituencies with different teams. The does it work question and the have we met the need questions, those get a lot harder to make sense of. Scaling frameworks do still have mechanics for these, and by and large, the overall actual mechanics are kind of similar. The big question for me is how often are we getting the feedback to both of these questions? And really here, across the 4 frameworks that I'm comparing today, we have, again, basically 2 options. In Nexus and Less and Scrum and Scale, we keep all of these feedback loops on the same single sprint rhythm that we would use if we were just a single Scrum team. So what that means is all of the teams that are together as a team of teams plan their sprints together as a group, figuring out which team will do which backlog items, etc. Then they start the sprint, they build individually. Then we get to the end of the sprint, we do a sprint review with all of the teams together, so everyone across the whole program can get the same understanding of what now exists that didn't before we did the sprint. Then teams have some kind of individual retrospective for themselves, and there is some kind of program level retrospective where teams can bring issues that are bigger than a team can fix for themselves, and where we can talk about how are we doing as an entire portfolio of teams. And that rhythm, which is basically the same pattern of single team Scrum, is still the same single sprint kind of time scale. So that entire loop would still be 2 weeks or 3 weeks, whatever it is, whatever makes sense for us, less than a month. Counterposed to this is SAFe, which makes a very different choice. In SAFe, all of the teams in a release train get together for a couple of days to do something called a program increment planning event, where together they map out the next several sprints worth of work. It's usually about 3 months, typically a quarter at a time. So they do that for 2 days until they feel like they have a reasonable plan for the next 3 months. And then they kind of separate. Each team does its own individual sprint cycles, planning from the product backlogs that they've kind of been assigned or delegated to them. They do their own sprint reviews, their own retrospectives kind of independently. And then we get together again at the end of the PI to get ready for the next planning event. And sometimes we do a bit of full program review stuff as part of that PI planning before we start planning the next one, all that kind of thing. So very different. Single sprint rhythm in Nexus, Less, and Scrum and Scale, multi-sprint rhythm in SAFe. Again, there are trade-offs here. Single sprint cadence, we're clearly getting more frequent feedback about product and more frequent feedback about process. Are we doing the right thing? That's being inspected at a whole program level, still every single sprint's worth of time. Are we getting better at being teams? Are we getting better at being a team of teams? That's getting inspected every single sprint. You also are generally getting better up and down collaboration. So top down is talking about vision stuff, bottom up is talking about their own ideas, and we're generally better at measuring progress towards impact rather than progress towards kind of our chunk of the assigned plan. On the multi-sprint cadence side, though, there are still some benefits. First off, certainly less team meeting overhead within individual sprints. Because if every team is planning together in a sprint and every team is doing sprint review together and we have a whole program retro every sprint, that means just based on math, there's some amount less of hours for individual teams to be building things in a sprint. So a little more efficient on the meeting overhead in the multi-sprint cadence. In theory, with the multi-sprint cadence, we still could be getting product level feedback every sprint too. And SAFe says every team should be able to release on demand. That says, that's not generally how I see teams interpret that cadence. Most organizations I've worked with that do SAFe feel like we're planning program increments 3 months at a time, and they're releasing about every 3 months at a time. It's not what they have to do. That's not a rule in SAFe. It's just the way people often interpret SAFe. So that is the back-end challenge, as I see it. Again, none of these are the single rightest or best answer, and different frameworks are making different kind of combinations of choices a little bit here and there. So before we pause for questions, I just kind of want to give you my overall commonalities that I've seen for organizations that successfully scale, however they, cross these T's and dot these I's, whichever choices they make. If you're going to be successful at scaling, first off, understand agility at the single team level before you try to be a team of teams. If you go from no agile teams to 20 agile teams in a scaled structure in the course of a day, and none of those teams can deliver to production without setting it on fire, your choice of scaling framework doesn't really matter. SAFe won't save you. Neither would less. It doesn't matter which pick. So let's understand agility and delivery with a single team before we try to be a giant team of teams. Secondly, the thing that matters most in terms of metrics and visualization is end value and the cycle time to value. Don't get caught up on individual team output metrics or process metrics. Quality matters, sure, but it's okay if different teams are seeing those things in different ways. What really matters is, as a structure, are we delivering end value, whatever that means for you? Is it revenue? Is it mission impact? Is it customer satisfaction? I don't know, whatever it is. Get people to agree on what value means, measure it and make it visible so that we can tell, are we doing the right thing? Are we getting anywhere? And time to value, that cycle time between when we as a program decide to try to make an idea happen, and when we can tell is it happening or not, that's a very important measure, because the shorter we make that metric, the lower our incremental risk is at any one time. The last point here, we like to talk about a concept like minimum viable product all the time in the Agile community. Let's just figure out what our MVP is. Let's not build anything more than we need, which I strongly endorse. That's a great thing to think about. But when it comes to scaling, I want to flip that a little bit. Let's talk about minimum viable bureaucracy. What is the smallest set of rules that we actually need to get out of our own way? And like minimum viable product, minimum viable bureaucracy is a structure that you discover through experiments. You could start with not much structure and add rules until you get to something that feels functional, or you could start with all the structure, implement full SAFe or something, and then peel back rules and layers that you feel you don't need until you get to something that feels as lean as possible. Either way can work. Personally, I prefer to build up rather than start from all of it and tear down, but whatever. The point is, where you end up needs to be a place that's actually delivering you agility. Agility is the goal, not doing SAFe, not doing less. The scaling frameworks are a means to an end, which is, how do we realize agility across this structure of team of teams? So feel free to adapt and improvise. What you end up with might be a structure that's really specific to just your organization. That's fine, as long as it's delivering you agility. So that overall is our kind of 3 big challenges, as I see them, of Agile scaling and some of the trade-offs there. I'm going to pause for questions for a little bit here. I see a couple in the chat already. Kingsley says, it would appear the single sprint cadence would be less risky with regards to product feedback and early course correction. And I would agree with you. Carrie is also saying, Kingsley, I agree. We utilize 2-week sprints. We conduct sprint review sessions with our product owner for acceptance and feedback. I agree. Looking at this single sprint cadence versus multi-sprint cadence, I think the single sprint rhythm generally produces less risk. And the trade-off in terms of things like beating overhead, for me, is worth it. For other organizations, though, they prefer the multi-sprint cadence for a bunch of reasons, some of them healthy and some of them not so healthy. The not so healthy ones would be things like, well, it feels like what we were doing before. And as I said earlier, that's not exactly necessarily a net benefit. Folks at the top of that structure might feel like, well, I only used to check in with my teams once a quarter, and now I still am, but we can say we're doing Agile. That's maybe nice for them. That doesn't necessarily mean it's better for teams or better for product direction. However, if we can't be nimble, maybe the multi-sprint cadence is the most effective we can be right now. Maybe that's our first step. And as we work to getting less and less coupled, and the single sprint structure starts to make more sense. Other questions? If folks want to type them in the chat or use the raise hand function, and I'll call on folks.
I can't seem to raise my hand, but I have a question.
Go right ahead, Nicole.
So I often have an unpleasant reaction to the 3 questions that used to be in the Scrum guide. And the Scrum of Scrums questions remind me of those questions.
Yeah.
Do you have any alternatives to those questions that kind of drive at the same goal?
Yeah, so certainly the 3 questions format that you see here in this template for Scrum of Scrums is super common. And for those of us who aren't familiar with this, that means the notion was during the daily Scrum, each participant should be answering the questions, what did I do since our last Scrum? What am I working on today? Do I have any impediments, or some variations of that? I also am not really a fan of it, because I have seen way too many teams come together. Everyone answers their questions in the air. No one's actually talks to each other, and they just walk away. So for many teams, the 3 questions format really just becomes a statusing behavior and not an effective self-organization method. If it's working for you, cool, keep doing it. I mean, it used to even be mentioned in the Scrum guide as a way to do the daily Scrum. It wasn't required, but it was a suggestion. These days, it's not even in the Scrum guide. They finally took it out, which I approve of. Personally, I mean, there's many other ways you could do it, and any way that works for the team is okay. My favorite is, instead of answering the 3 questions, I have teams just look at backlog items. And so we'll say, is this backlog item being worked on right now? Okay, by who? What's going on with that? Are there any issues? How about this one? How about this one? And the goal is to get to the same goal of the 3 questions, which is, can we identify things like, are we working 1 or 2 items at a time until they're done, which is usually what we want, or is everything in progress at the same time, which is probably not useful. Is everybody helping out during the sprint? Do we need to make any adjustments to our sprint backlog? Those kind of things. Do we still look like we're on track to meet our sprint goal, whatever that is for that particular sprint? So yeah, I prefer to look at backlog items. I also prefer to not direct the talking. So I don't like when Scrum Masters show up and they're just calling on people one at a time. I think instead, I want the team to be really running the daily Scrum. So even if they need someone to kind of convene it, maybe the Scrum Master says something like, welcome to the daily Scrum, everybody. Who'd like to start? And then you look at the floor so that no one feels like you're calling on them. And if nobody says anything, you just keep standing there looking at the floor. You let them sit with that intentional silence until finally somebody will start the conversation. So yeah, at the Scrum of Scrums level, I feel it's not necessarily intrinsically as often broken as it is with a single team level, but still, there's no reason why you have to conduct your Scrum of Scrums with those questions either. It's just an example.
Okay, thank you.
No problem, but great question, Nicole.
Sure.
Any others?
Mac, this is Carrie. I would just like to provide some additional feedback to Nicole. Yeah. During our Scrum of Scrums, our Scrum Masters will ask any of the team members if anyone has anything to contribute to please raise their hand in the Zoom. And once they start raising hands, it's their responsibility to pass it off to a teammate to give the update. So the Scrum Master isn't facilitating the call, they just kick it off, and then the team takes it from there. And that seems to really work for us.
Yeah, one of the things I think is most often, and thanks for those comments, Carrie. One of the things I think is most often misunderstood about Scrum is the daily Scrum meeting. And a way that it is very often misunderstood is people think it's the Scrum Master's meeting, and it's not.
Correct.
It is the developers meeting. Yeah.
Thanks, Carrie.
Any other questions or reactions to any of the stuff we're talking about here? All right, then. Well, I guess I'll go into closeout. So thanks everybody for joining us on this Friday. I hope things are lovely wherever you are. It's a nice sunny day outside of my window. Here is my contact info, which we will also generally include in the post webinar email that we send out. If we are not connected on LinkedIn, by all means, reach out. I have a very large network of Agilists all over the world. I'm always happy to add to it. Also, I am Bowtie Agility on Mastodon, if you do that particular social network. If you give it a follow, I promise I only post Agile stuff. You won't see me yelling at Panera about a sandwich or something. Just things related to Agile, I promise. Also, please consider giving NextUp a follow on all the socials. Again, especially LinkedIn, but also all the others. We post all sorts of great stuff, including monthly webinars like this, great blog articles, both of which are great ways to earn things like Scrum education units if you've got credentials to maintain. And sometimes we have class discounts and all sorts of other stuff. So hopefully we will see you online somewhere, or I'll see you in a class or anything else. If there's ever anything that I or the NextUp can do for you in terms of helping out with your own individual Agile journey or those of your particular organizations, again, we're here and we would love to assist you. So thanks for coming, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording and wish you a fantastic Friday.